Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's great to have you with us. This week we're looking ahead to the story of the Transfiguration as we prepare ourselves to begin once again our journey through the season of Lent. Before we get started in looking at Mark's account of said Transfiguration, if you haven't done so already, you might like to download the sheet that accompanies this Bible study. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find the link for that just below the video. On the sheet, you will find the text of our reading, plenty of space for you to make your own notes and reflections, other texts that relate to this passage that you might wish to take a look at, and the questions that we're going to be thinking about later on. So without further ado, let us dive into this week's passage, which comes from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 9. To set the scene a bit for us, we've kind of reached the hinge point in Mark's Gospel, in which the action shifts from Galilee and Jesus' ministry in that region towards Jerusalem, and ultimately therefore towards the cross. If we step back a little bit into Mark chapter 8, we find that 6 days before the Transfiguration, Jesus had asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter had answered, "You're the Messiah." He was the first person to make that declaration. But he then struggled with what Jesus explained afterwards, that the Messiah would be one who would have to suffer and to die before rising again 3 days later. Peter's response is, no, you can't do that, Jesus. And he's promptly told to get behind me, Satan. So it's a very dramatic scene in the run-up to this. And I imagine Peter feeling particularly shaken, maybe the other disciples feeling a bit like that too. And they'd all been told that if they wanted to be disciples of Jesus, they'd need to deny themselves and take up their crosses and follow him. So who are the key figures in this incident that, as I say, occurred 6 days after that particular dramatic event? Well, we have lots of characters popping up in different ways. We have Peter, James and John, most obviously. They are 3 out of the first 4 disciples that Jesus called, and they kind of form his inner circle. They're with him in various of these major events, and they are the witnesses to the Transfiguration. We also have Moses as the one who received the law from God on Mount Sinai, and in many ways was the greatest figure in the history of the people of Israel. And we have, as well as that, Elijah, who was considered to be the greatest of the prophets, and significantly didn't die, but was carried up to heaven in a fiery chariot. It was also understood that Elijah returning may well be the precursor to the coming of the Messiah. And indeed, we find in John's Gospel that John the Baptist is asked, "Are you Elijah, or are you a Moses-like prophet figure, or the Messiah, or quite what are you?" So there's a lot of significance to what happens in this passage. And as we'll see, there are a range of deep connections to the Old Testament. What we have here is arguably, on the one hand, an epiphany, and on the other hand, a theophany. And those two things are brought together. So we have revelation about who Jesus is to the disciples, and we also have divine speech, God speaking in to what's going on. And so those two things are brought together. To give just a bit of a glimpse into the background material that relates to this passage from the Old Testament, some particularly significant texts are, for example, Exodus 24, verses 12 to 18, in which Moses goes up the mountain, Mount Sinai, to receive the law from God, and God appears in the cloud on the top of the mountain. We've also got 2 Kings, chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, that recounts the final moments of Elijah and his handing on the prophetic mantle to his friend Elisha, his disciple. And as I say, Elijah doesn't die a normal death, he's carried on up into heaven. Those are the two main things, but as we move through, we'll find other allusions to the Old Testament. It's worth noting that Mark is not the only gospel writer to tell us the story of the Transfiguration. We also find accounts in Matthew 17, verses 1 to 8, and in Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. And there are some subtle differences between what Mark tells us and what Matthew and Luke go on to subsequently say, and I'll mention one or two of those as we move through. And finally, while its authorship is disputed, we do find a reference in 2 Peter chapter 1 to the events of the Transfiguration. So let's dive into the passage. As we've said when we set the scene, 6 days after the revelation that Jesus is the Messiah and the one who would suffer and die, 3 of his closest friends are taken aside away from the other disciples and given a particular insight into who Jesus is and why he matters. They have a private experience, as one of the commentaries I looked at termed it. Note that outside of Mark's passion narrative in chapter 14, this reference to the events happening 6 days later is the most precise time reference that we have in Mark's Gospel. I think there's a significance in that. It relates, I would suggest, to Moses on Mount Sinai. In that reading I mentioned from Exodus 24, Moses is up there for 6 days meeting with God. So I don't think it's an accident that that's the time span that we have. Mountains are significant places in the biblical story. They're often places where encounters with God happen. So I mentioned Moses on Sinai already. Elijah also had a significant moment on a mountainside when he was in dire straits and just wanted to give up and die. It was not in the dramatic events that surrounded him on the mountainside, the fire and the wind and the earthquake. It was when he heard the still small voice of God, and that renewed him and spurred him to keep going. So mountains are, in more than just those incidents, significant meeting places with God. We don't know specifically which mountain it was where the Transfiguration took place. I understand the 2 most probable candidates are Mount Hermon, which is slightly north of Caesarea Philippi, and Mount Tabor Tabor in the centre of Galilee. Jesus, in that instant, is utterly transformed in front of his disciples' eyes. There could be an echo there of Daniel 12 and teaching about the Son of Man, or indeed Moses again. When he comes down from Sinai, his face is glowing, bright white, and meeting with God does that to Moses to the point where he has to veil his face for others to be able to look at him. So it could be reflecting either of those things, or perhaps even both. We're told that the whiteness of Jesus's clothes is better than a launderer could possibly have achieved. And that links into Psalm 51 verse 7 that talks about being made white as snow, and also Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 2. So again, more Old Testament allusions. Moses and Elijah being the ones that appear is of great significance. Moses was given the law, Elijah was the greatest of the prophets. And there's very much a sense there of a bringing together of Israel's journey up to that point that Jesus is going to take further through the cross and resurrection. There's something there about the way Moses points to deliverance and evokes the story of the Exodus and the setting God's people free from oppression, and how in Elijah we get promise and hope. All of those things are coming together in the person of Jesus. It's interesting that Mark talks about Elijah first and then Moses, Whereas generally people talked about the law and the prophets, and thus Moses and Elijah in the other order. And if you look at Matthew 17 verse 3 or Luke 9 verse 30, you find that they've reversed Mark's order, put them in a more conventional order. So it's interesting that Mark emphasises Elijah. And indeed, actually, his portrayal of Jesus is very strongly as a prophetic figure, so maybe that's why. The disciples, greeted with Jesus in dazzling white and Moses and Elijah, quite understandably panicked. And we're told that Peter didn't really know what he was saying when he said, "It's good for us to be here, let's have 3 tabernacles or tents like the ones that the Ark of the Covenant was contained in the wilderness. So we'll have one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus." It could be that Peter was trying to prolong the moment, to try and make this amazing glimpse into the heart of the divine last as long as possible. It could also be that he was trying to interpret it in a way that fitted within his existing worldview, that made sense. Hence, talking about tabernacles, picking up on the idea of the Feast of Tabernacles from Leviticus 23. Either way, though, I think there's something about the clumsiness of what Peter says in this instance that points to its authenticity. I don't think you would make that up, because it does not really sort of show Peter in the best light. So I think, for me, it points to the genuineness of what Peter had to say here. So Jesus, in what happens, is bringing to its culmination everything that's gone before. And that's kind of summed up by what happens next when the cloud descends and engulfs even the disciples as well as Jesus. And the heavenly voice reiterates, "This is my beloved Son," and then tells the disciples to listen to him. That's what we have. There is an echo of Jesus' baptism from chapter 1, verses 10 to 11. Jesus is affirmed, once again in this incident, as God's Son and Israel's Messiah. The cloud descending takes us again back to Moses on Sinai. We can find that in Exodus chapter 19, verse 9. And it's a theophany, it's divine speech, that itself picks up on Psalm 2, verse 7, and Isaiah 42, verse 1. So there's loads of Old Testament stuff going on here, so it's very symbolically rich. Jesus is being shown to be the culmination in his very being of all Israel's story before, as I say, he takes it on by going to the cross. In the New Testament, it's quite true that clouds are often associated with the return of Jesus. So if you look in Mark 13, verse 26, you find reference to the Son of Man coming down from heaven on the cloud in Mark's little apocalypse. And you find him referred to there as the Son of Man, which was Jesus' favourite title. So I think there's a kind of invoking of that kind of connection and imagery as well. It's pointing ahead to where this is ultimately all going for all creation, when God is going to renew, transfigure, transform the heavens and the earth and enable them to flourish in all of their fullness. The disciples being told to listen to Jesus in verse 7 is yet another Old Testament allusion, this time to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 5. In Deuteronomy 18, Moses points to a mysterious prophet-like figure who's going to come afterwards. And nobody quite knows who that was meant to be. As I say in John's Gospel, the suspicion is John the Baptist may be that mysterious prophet, but we can't be sure. Either way, so there's another connection as the disciples are told, listen to what you're being told, take this seriously. Suddenly, after all the drama, all the amazing stuff they've just witnessed, it kind of all stops as soon as it started, and the disciples are once more alone with Jesus, as we find in verse 8. Jesus being the one who remains after Moses and Elijah have vanished, I think also shows that he was greater than them, that he was bringing to culmination all that they'd done. Peter's declaration, therefore, in chapter 8, verse 29 of Jesus as the Messiah is affirmed. And we find that the greatness of Jesus is in and not despite the suffering that's going to come. He's going to the cross, as scandalous as that was in that particular understanding, was not something that made him lesser than Moses and Elijah. He was still greater than them. The disciples, finally in verse 9, are told to keep quiet about the events that they'd witnessed. I imagine that being an incredibly hard thing to do. You've had this amazing experience, you need to talk about it, you need to process it, and you're told you have to keep it to yourself until after the resurrection. So that can't have been easy. But I think it's probably post-resurrection that the disciples were able to fully understand what was going on there and the significance of those amazing few minutes on the mountain. It's like in that instance, I think the best way I can understand the Transfiguration is that if you imagine a kind of curtain that separates earth from heaven, and imagine it being pulled apart for a few moments so that we get a glimpse of heaven on earth. I feel that that's what was going on. And I'm inclined to agree with those commentators who suggest that the Transfiguration was primarily about enabling James and John, but particularly Peter, to keep going in the midst of the trying events that would follow. I think this was about after Peter had been so shaken up by being really wrong about what being the Messiah actually meant. It's a way of saying to him, you will see the glory of God, and you can trust that Jesus really is who he says he is, as much as he's turning all your ideas about what it means to be the Messiah upside down.